All right, guys, welcome, welcome, welcome. We are back and ready to go with part two of the 1920s. So, what I'd like to do today is talk about our question number two. And once again, I'd like you to take a special note of what the question is. Perhaps you can write this down. And as you view, keep your focus on things that would help you respond to this question. So, for part two, our leading question will be: how did radio, movies, jazz music, and great writers help to make the 1920s a time of creativity and cultural change? So, creativity and cultural change. So, let's see if we can move along and see if we get some responses to that question. First and foremost, which is kind of a dying art, which is a little sad for me, radio. I don't listen to the radio as much as I used to, and I don't think you guys do either. Radio was everything when I was growing up, and our little tapes and all that. But that's neither here nor there. During the 20s, the radio went from being like a little known novelty, like something that a couple of people had, to a really, really big deal. And it was something that everyone had in the home. Now, the radio, and this is actually probably a smaller one, looks something like this. And we know a phonograph and all that. But, to have a radio, this is actually the stance that she has sitting in front of that radio right there, was how a lot of people enjoyed the radio. So a guy named Macaroni invented the radio. By 1920s, we saw a guy who liked to kind of play around with the radio. One thing that he did, he started playing records. The phonograph right here. And it was mildly broadcast from this radio, and we saw a new trend on how the radio started to influence culture via entertainment. The very first radio station, KDKA, was created in 1920. And by 1922, just 2 years later, the United States had about 570 stations. And the cool thing about it is that although we were such a big country, we were all able to share in very similar types of programming and news. So it really was a revolutionary way of sharing with your fellow, American. Next up is movies, and we still love the movies today. Movies exploded in popularity during the 20s for a couple of different reasons. I'm just going to give you a couple things out of the many reasons. At first, we should know that movies were very short, simple pieces. They didn't have any sounds. As a matter of fact, one of the first movies during World War I, The Birth of a Nation, was produced, and it was a very controversial film that some consider racist. Miss Flood certainly considers racist, if you've ever heard anything about this movie. But it was received partly because of The Birth of a Nation, which we'll talk about in class, but its popularity of Birth of the Nation really kind of helped this new way of entertainment to really spread and become popular. But that was a silent movie, and it had subtitles. Later on, we saw something called talkies, and this is more like what you and I are used to. So it's films with sound, or talkies. So the talkies actually had the movie clips or the movie playing in the background, and then voices, and that's what we are used to as well. So we saw not only the arrival of the popularity of the movies and movie going, but these talkies were invented as well, and we all know the impact that these movies have even on us today. So it is a pretty big deal. 1920 we saw our favorite rodent make an appearance in a short film called Steamboat, and that introduced animation. By the end of the 1920s, we saw Americans lining up and shelling out lots of money for those movies. So movies and radios were certainly a big part of American pop culture and entertainment. And all of that was really kind of under the big heading of something called the Jazz Age. So let's look at the Jazz Age. I am not a huge fan of jazz unless there's singing on top of it, but it's something very therapeutic about jazz. And some of you may play instruments and share the very calmness of what jazz is. So jazz has its origins in African American culture. It originated, many believe, in New Orleans, and it is a musical blend of several different forms: from the lower South in general. It influenced music, dancing, clothing, lifestyle, and even writing. So some of the writers, F. Scott Fitzgerald, which I think you may have heard of. He was the guy who wrote The Great Gatsby. He is actually credited with the term the Jazz Age, not jazz, but the term the Jazz Age. And he probably most popularly explored that kind of jazz era in The Great Gatsby. And Gertrude Stein, which is a name you may not be as familiar with, but important nonetheless, because Stein penned the term the Lost Generation. And the Lost Generation referred to a group of writers who chose to live in Europe after World War I. So it's kind of like that disconnect and a very brooding group of people. Hemingway was one of the Lost Generationers, and he wrote about war experiences. George Gershwin may be another person that you are familiar with, and hopefully when we look at the Jazzies in class, you will be familiar with a couple of Gershwin's tunes as well. All right, a couple people here dancing along. I don't know if you've heard of some of the dances of the jazz age, but hopefully we'll have some people dance along and the Charleston, those kicking of those legs, and we see those ladies with that short hair and those those high hemlines out there having a good time. We would be remiss if we talked about the 1920s but never mentioned Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance. So I want to start with a little piece on life in Harlem. So Harlem, we know, is in New York, and Harlem became the epicenter of Black art and culture. But prior to that, we talked about W.E.B. Du Bois as a well-educated African-American leader, one of the co-founders of the NAACP. And he helped to promote the African American arts movement. He was among a lot of people, but he was very instrumental in that. And Harlem, again, became that epicenter of art and creativity. So what we're going to do is take a brief look at the Harlem Renaissance and a couple of people that we should definitely know in relation to the Harlem Renaissance. As far as artists were concerned, in general, they won a lot of fame during this era and they were recognized. And if you are familiar with the Twitter hashtag that went on not too long ago, Oscar So White, and it was basically a protest of how the lack of diversity and representation of, art and music at least being acknowledged at the Oscars. This probably would not have been the case during the Harlem Renaissance because the artists were recognized, and the ones who were mainly recognized were Black artists. Now, it didn't mean that they enjoyed the freedoms of whites, but they did at least receive its recognition. So much of the Harlem Renaissance and the art in general focused on the experiences of African Americans. A couple of writers you should be familiar with, and there's so many, and like I said, hopefully in class we'll be able to look at so many more, but I want you to be familiar with people like, obviously, Langston Hughes, this guy right here, and him, along with Langston Hughes, we had other poets like Claude McKay who wrote about Black defiance and hope. So kind of continuing that protest for equality, but they handled it in a artistic way. And Langston Hughes is one of my absolute favorites as far as poets. As far as writers are concerned, one of my favorites is this young lady right here who had a really, really troubled life. But if you ever get a chance to read her works, Zora Neale Hurston was iconic of the era and in sharing her experience as an African American woman. And this guy right here, James Weldon Johnson, also wrote about facing white prejudice. And there's something else I'll tell you about James Weldon Johnson later on that some of you may be familiar with. So some of the performers and musicians, a lot of people know these guys. I like the dude on the left. His name is Paul Robeson. Robeson. I don't know if you guys know a lot about him. You probably know this young lady, Josephine Baker, and maybe even Louis Armstrong. But what I really liked about Robeson is he came actually to New York, Harlem specifically, to be an attorney. So he was very well educated, and he found that he had yet another gift, and he won fame in performing in actual movies and stage plays. And it was a big deal for him to be the lead in Othello. Now, Josephine Baker, Halle Berry played Josephine Baker in an HBO movie probably 10, 15 years ago. She did a decent job, but what I really like about Josephine Baker is that she was a tough cookie and she was very talented. Some people may liken her to a Beyonce, but I don't think I would go that crazy with it. I just want to say that she was definitely a beautiful woman, very talented woman, but she did have some tragedy in her life as well. What I really recall most about Josephine Baker and her story is that she was upset about her treatment. And although she had so much fame and popularity and celebrity in the United States, she was still treated like a second class citizen. She still had to enter the back and not the front of a theater that she was headlining at. And as a result, eventually she packed up her bags, she packed up her toys, and she moved to Europe. And she experienced a lot more tolerance in Europe and still experienced a lot of tragedy. But at the end of the day, I think that she made the right decision for her. Musicians like Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith, Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington certainly were iconic and was vital for jazz during the Harlem Renaissance. Another aspect we should focus on is American heroes. And because of radio and movies, we saw a whole bunch of American heroes kind of hop on the scene. One of the ones that we'll talk about in class is Charlie Chaplin. And you've seen this guy. He has on like a bowl hat and a weird little mustache and kind of little beady eyes. And we'll talk about who Charlie Chaplin was, but he was a really, really big deal. I like talking about these two heroes, though. On the left, we have my girl, Amelia Earhart, and over here, the homie, Charles Lindbergh. And Lindbergh has a really deep and a lot of tragedy in with his story as well. But for now, just for focusing on the happy stuff, Lindbergh was a daredevil pilot, and he eventually won a huge prize for a nonstop transatlantic, that's across the Atlantic flight. And he flew from New York to Paris, and he was referred to as Lucky Lindy. He flew on a solo flight, and that's what the really big deal was with that. Amelia Earhart, right here, became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic, which is a really big deal. If you think about it, women had just basically received the right to vote. And this woman boarded a plane by herself and became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic and returning to the United States as a hero. Could you imagine all the young girls and how they must have felt so much hope just in that one kind of revolutionary attempt of hers. And in 1937, she was most of the way through a record-breaking flight around the world when unfortunately she disappeared over the Pacific Ocean. Till this day, 2016, we really don't know what happened to Amelia, and there is a lot of theories about what could have happened to her, and it really, really just remains a mystery, which is really sad, and I hope that one day we can figure out, but her legacy nonetheless is very inspirational. And, oops, sorry. All right, so next up, I just wanted to show you this little diagram here of that solo plane that Lindbergh took. Talk about a little bit of legroom there. All right, and I wanted to also check out some sports heroes. There were many, but I think most of you may at least be familiar with the name Babe Ruth. He was known as the Sultan of SWAT. Ruth was legendary on the baseball field for his home runs, and a lot of people kind of hovered around those radios listening to Babe Ruth, and he was a really, really big deal, along with other people's that I hope that we are able to unpack and examine in class. So Without further ado, the answer to the question will be, how did radio, movies, jazz music, and great writers help make the 1920s a time of creativity and cultural change? All right. So within that, we cover the topics of the new forms of mass media with radio and movies, the jazz music, the jazz age, the origins of jazz music. And then we looked at the 1920s, a time of creativity, particularly the Harlem Renaissance. We also looked at the heroes and kind of the daredevil and risky things they did, and how culturally all of that stuff was spread by new forms of mass media, and how it probably changed the face of, or the culture of, the United States. So I want you to think about that. How did radio, movies, jazz, and music, great writers help make the 1920s a time of creativity and cultural change? And I will catch you guys in class. Good luck with your assignment.